Welcome back. UFOs, are they real? We're talking with John Lear on the subject.
The most commonly described alien is about 3.5 feet tall and is wearing a silvery spacesuit or coveralls.
I can see the expressions on my face. Is this for real?
Yeah.
This guy making this stuff up, he's nuts.
Now, I'm not making this up. This is an Air Force. You can pick out an Air Force physics book and read this stuff. And at the end of the chapter, they go on to say, this leads us to believe in the unpleasant possibility of alien visitors to our planet, or at least of alien-controlled UFOs. Now, the picture that we have of the big head that the Air Force describes, this picture was drawn by an Army surgeon. These are one of the bodies that was recovered in the famous Roswell incident of 1947.
Tell us about that.
It was the first flying saucer that crashed and was recovered by the Army.
Originally, the Roswell Army Air Base announced it had recovered a flying saucer from a ranch outside Roswell. The story made headlines around the world, but hours later, higher up said no, it was a weather balloon. Pieces of the balloon were shown to reporters. Years later, the officer who first visited the crash site, Major Jesse Marcel, confided that the weather balloon story was a cover-up.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was.
What was shown to reporters wasn't what he found.
The newsmen saw very little of that material, a very small portion of it. And none of the important things, like these members that had these hieroglyphics or markings on. And when the general came in, he told me not to say anything, that he would handle it.
Since Marcel's admission, scores of other witnesses have also surfaced.
And one of the surgeons that was responsible for the autopsy drew that picture.
This is an autopsy report. Now, you said the government goes to great lengths, the Air Force in particular, to discredit this kind of stuff. Where did this come from? How did you get this?
That came from the private collection of Leonard Stringfield, who was one of the premier researchers. He worked for the Air Force in the early 50s in a secret project reporting UFOs. Then as a civilian, he continued his private research, and this is out of his collection.
You think maybe it's a top secret area? If the Air Force actually does have them, maybe they got him here?
I'm certain they do. Up at the test site, there's a report that of the 3 that they got in perfectly good condition, at least 1 is up at the test site and has flown, and 1 was being flown as of 1981.
By us?
By us, yeah.
We mentioned at the top of the show that perhaps a breakthrough might be coming, that some of these people from MJ-12 or from the Project Blue Book who are in on the government's research and who saw some of this stuff might be ready to talk. We got about a minute left. Why don't you tell me about that?
It's our information that, that part of MJ-12 wants to release it, part of it doesn't. We're hoping that we can do this, but of course, as researchers, we're not aware of all the ramifications. We just know of what we're looking at. So we would like to see them release it, but we really don't know if they are.
Okay, John Lear, it's been very interesting. You keep us posted.
Sure will.
Thank you. We'll see you next week with more of On the Record.
And as soon as that aired, I started getting calls, and it didn't stop. What was the deal on that guy? Is that for real? Do you have any more information? Are you going to do that again? I realized this topic touches the pulse of the public in a way that I did not understand and did not appreciate at the time. I had him back on again the following year, and in between I started reading about UFOs, just trying to separate wheat from chaff. It's a gigantic learning curve, and figuring out what makes sense and what's real is really hard. So I tried to educate myself and get ready for that next Lear appearance, and the response from the public was even bigger.
Now, on April 25th, 1964, was the first official communication between our government and the aliens. 3 saucers landed there by prearranged agreement. It was filmed by 5 high-speed cameras, 68,000 feet of film. The reason we know this is because in 1972, when they were going to release the first information about UFOs to the public, a very knowledgeable writer, his name was Robert Emenegger, was asked by the agency to write a documentary, which he did. And they were going to release this thing, and we had the whole history of the UFOs, and the last part of the documentary was the footage of the saucer landing. But in 1973, when they're ready to go, we had Watergate. And they were faced with 2 problems. Number 1 is they didn't think the public could handle 2 traumatic experiences at the same time. And number 2, they thought that the public would perceive this picture of aliens and spacecraft is a ploy by Nixon to divert the attention from Watergate.
The inevitable result of these charges has been to raise serious questions about the integrity of the White House itself.
So they shelved it. The documentary actually came out. It was narrated by Rod Serling, but instead of the real footage, they had drawings of these flying saucer landing, and they said, Rod Serling says,
let's look at an incident that might happen in the future, or perhaps could have happened already.
According to John Lear, this is the only snippet of real UFO footage that aired in the documentary.
You believe, in part, that the movies E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, were not entirely just the creative products of some Hollywood director, that maybe there's more to that. Why don't you explain?
They were carefully guided by representatives from MJ12, who is this organization that is in charge of the cover-up, in order to get us ready for the release of the information that there are indeed aliens.
Oh, to prepare us that the idea of benevolent aliens from outer space are going to help us out.
Unfortunately, they're not so benevolent, so they made probably one of the most disastrous mistakes when E.T. was put out. At that time was before we discovered what I call the double cross or the grand deception. And they were trying to get us used to the benevolent little creatures, but that isn't the case.
I had him on a third time in 1988, and he hinted at the time that he met this guy who was trying to get hired at this place out in the Nevada desert, and that he thought it was going to be a really big deal.
John Lear's new friend not only knew what was going on out there, he knew when and where to look to the skies.
Good evening, this is John Lear.
In March 1989, he accompanied a small group to the outskirts of Area 51. 3 Wednesday nights in a row, they watched a glowing disc rise above the mountains over Papoose Dry Lake.
Did you see that move it did? No, I didn't.
The person who initiated the desert outing was a scientist who claimed he worked at Papoose on flying saucers. That scientist was interviewed live on television in May 1989 from Lear's driveway.
What George didn't know was that this would be even bigger than John Lear. It turned out to change everything we know about the government and UFOs. Coming up,